Good morning, everyone. Sabah al-khair, boker tov. Nivin, I thought about it before I saw you this morning. So I'm happy to present the findings from the infrastructure group, and Tarek is pretty modest because he played a big part in the composition of this policy paper and all the work around it. So first of all, I will say just a few words about infrastructure. First of all, it's a hard word to pronounce, as I've discovered, and I'm going to say it many times now. Second of all, it's a very wide category that encapsulates many services and facilities that are necessary in order to function effectively. And you can see some examples here in the photos: public transportation, drainage, sewage, open spaces, etc. We've all experienced, I think, different forms of infrastructure while traveling here this morning, whether you took the car or the public transport. And you can probably agree with me that good infrastructure can render life in the urban space accessible, safe, convenient, whereas degraded level of infrastructure can make it a bit more difficult. And I think it's also important to mention when we speak about infrastructure that it's not only a technical issue, so it's not only up to engineers and urban planners, it's also a social issue and a political one as well. And this is especially true in Jerusalem. And not just in Jerusalem, in many cities, the quality of the infrastructure is not unanimous across the urban scale and space. So some neighborhoods enjoy very good levels of roads and drainage and sewage and other parks and amenities, while other neighborhoods might severely lack such services. And in Jerusalem specifically, we can pretty much notice the big divide between West and East Jerusalem, and we started to touch on that in the last presentation of Avni. So generally speaking, in West Jerusalem, in the Israeli Jewish neighborhood, we have a much better level of infrastructure compared to East Jerusalem, and by that I mean the Palestinian neighborhoods of East Jerusalem. So in terms of the sewage, the roads, the electricity, the parks, and other amenities. And of course, this is a generalization, so there are some exceptions, and not all neighborhoods in West Jerusalem or East Jerusalem are the same, but as a generalization, this is a rule of thumb that we're very much aware of, and the project touches upon. So what did the groups do in this project? In the infrastructure group, we had actually have three groups. So one Palestinian from Authority neighborhood, one Israeli from Abu Tor and Baka neighborhood, and a mixed group of professionals and urban planners and architects who came from different neighborhoods of the city. So for those of you who are not very familiar with the geography of Jerusalem, you can see here on the map the geographical area where the groups worked. So it's almost like one neighborhood that is divided into an Israeli and Palestinian neighborhood. So whereas in the different groups later on today, you will see that the groups worked, the people in the groups came from all over Jerusalem. This group was more geographically focused. And this was chosen as a kind of a representative case because even though we're speaking about two neighborhoods, they really symbolize the differences between East and West Jerusalem and just separated by one street. But life can be quite difficult in these very geographically closed spaces. So in terms of the process, there was quite a long process, a participatory research project research that involved participants, local residents from the two groups that were recruited by social media and poster advertising. You can see an example here, and also by the facilitators' personal connections. For example, Tarek Nassar, who was a facilitator here in this group, knows many people, and they also collaborated with the community council, so they were able to draw on diverse participants, different ages, gender, occupation, etc. And the main methodology they used was PhotoVoice, which is a visual methodology where participants take photos of different things they see in the neighborhood. They could do it via structured walks or just, during their own time while just living their daily life in the neighborhood. They took the photos, then they met for a series of discussions, and they decided collectively which photos they want to represent them in the exhibition, and also which photos should be used as kind of the basis for the follow-up vision and recommendations. And I will show you some examples of these as we go along. So in terms of the problems, the participants were asked to identify what kind of problems they're facing, and there are many, many problems related to infrastructure. And we can see that there is also a lot of similarities between the different groups. So this slide is kind of showing you the problems that all of them, regardless of their area in the city, identified. So they talked about parking issues, lack of parking, not enough public space or poorly maintained public space, issues of drainage and poor sanitation, not enough lighting, spaces not being safe enough for pedestrians, bad connectivity. And the table you can see here is actually from the survey conducted by the Davis Institute, where neighborhoods from all across the city were asked openly about different things they would like to see improved in the neighborhood. And infrastructure was one of the main leading issues, both in the Palestinian group and in the Israeli one, from all across the city. But when we zoom into the neighborhood level, we still see some differences between the Palestinian side and the Israeli side. So this is the Palestinian Neighborhood Authority, and the issues that they outlined in no particular order. So there is the dirtiness and rubbish on the streets, poor sanitation, not enough green spaces or open spaces in general, steep roads and inclination that make it hard for people with walking disabilities, exposed power lines and insufficient housing, crowdedness and density, and also a lot of water and electricity cuts. And I'm going to show you a few photos that the participants took themselves, which kind of give you a very visual sense of these issues. So the first one, you can see tires just burning up in an open area in the neighborhood that can be used for much nicer purposes. The second one is a typical photo of a street. You can see exposed electricity lines. You can see that the environment is overall degraded and not very clean. And the last one is another typical street that has a kind of steep inclination without any support. You can see that it's just not kind of run down, generally speaking. Whereas when we look at the Israeli side, the main issues that they outlined were insufficient vegetation, not enough playgrounds for children, stray cats, which is not a purely infrastructure issue, but came up as one of the topics, lack of historic preservation, and just generally neglected appearance of buildings and facilities, dirtiness, and poor accessibility to other neighborhoods, whether by public transportation or by car. So a few examples. This is an old kiosk in the neighborhood that's not being used currently and could be made into a connective space. Another photo is this building where a lot of trees were cut down because of a future redevelopment that is going to take place there. And the last one, this is just a neglected area on the seam line between the Palestinian and Israeli neighborhood, which again can be used as kind of a connective and shared space between the neighborhoods, but is just not being well used right now. And I think it's important to say that even though you might see some similarity in the issues, because both groups kind of talk about neglected spaces and dirty spaces, there are still differences between the neighborhoods. And we can see that the Palestinian neighborhood is much more neglected and run down than the Israeli one. The waste collection is much poorer on that side, etc. So in terms of the residents' visions and what do we like to see happening in the neighborhood. So like Tarek said before, they decided to focus on the issue of open public spaces because infrastructure is a really, really big topic. And they came up with this approach that's also called placemaking. You might have heard of it before, which is kind of an adopt that sees residents as taking charge of their own environment and coming up with solutions that are based on their immediate needs and doesn't necessarily require a lot of investment, but kind of creative and soft measures of investing in the built environment to make it nicer. And you can see here, for example, so one suggestion was to turn this neglected area into a park for children using recycled materials where kids can play together, when this can be kind of made into a shared space. It's a small-scale initiative, but it can really make a difference in the neighborhood, and that's the idea of placemaking, that you can kind of do small-scale, spontaneous things through collaboration with the community. Another example is this one, where you're kind of using this old kiosk reopen it as a cafe, as a place to meet people where adults and kids can play together and have a coffee and meet each other. There are more examples that you will be able to see later on in the exhibition after lunch. So in terms of the recommendation, there are many, many things. I kind of divided them into long-term and short-term. And there are many solutions that are recommended to, first of all, amend the deep inequality in the level of infrastructure between, first of all, the two sides of the city, but also to solve the individual problems that each neighborhood faces. And these require, of course, massive investment of funds and resources in order to rectify and update the old infrastructures and to build new ones. So examples include, for example, improving public transportation, and so also the connection between East and West Jerusalem that is currently not very good. With a few exceptions in the light rail, the transport systems are pretty much segregated. Fixing pavements, adding street lighting, improving the scope and frequency of waste collection, building more spaces, green spaces and parks, especially in the Palestinian neighborhoods, and the list can go on and on. But really what the group wanted to do is to focus on the small-scale projects and to initiate kind of short-term, affordable solutions that can be expanded later on, and mainly the upgrade and renovation of open public spaces. And this can be done using paint, using furniture, using things that are relatively available. And they also require, and I think this was one of the main takeaways from this group, was that they require trust and legitimacy from the community, because if we're just going to build them without the community, they're not going to be used, they're not going to be able, not everyone is going to be able to benefit from them. So they're kind of soft measures that can go a long way in terms of improving people's life. And only by building these through trust and making the community a part of these changes will they actually sustain for a long time and be able to benefit everyone in the neighborhood. So in conclusion, by gradually coming up with solutions through a bottom-up approach, the community will be better equipped and more motivated to pursue large-scale projects and confront greater challenges in the future. Thank you.